All right, let's get started. Okay, so hello and welcome to this webinar on Drupal 8 debugging techniques. Now, just a bit about myself. My name is Ivan Zucek and I've been using Drupal for about 10 years. I remember still installing Drupal, I think 4.6 back in the day. And ever since then, I've been focused on Drupal. Of course, I've dabbled in other technologies, but Drupal has been my bread and butter for the last 10 or so years. And for the last 5 years, I've been producing content, writing tutorials and videos over at webwash.net. So if you want to learn more about Drupal, head over there. But today we are here to talk about debugging and the myriad of ways you can debug in Drupal. So if you have used Drupal in the past, you know that there's always 10 different ways to do things. And when it comes to debugging, there's 10 different ways to debug. So we'll first look at how to turn on debugging and also turn off caching in Drupal 8. Now, I'll go into more detail about that in that section. And then in section 2, we'll look at the Devel module and more importantly, 2 submodules that come with it, Kint and WebProfiler. And then we'll look at how to debug variables in Twig using Kint. Then we'll look at Drupal console. So Drupal console is a new CLI tool or command line interface tool for Drupal 8. It can be used to generate boilerplate code, set up sites, but it can also help us debug things in Drupal. And then in section 5 and 6, we'll focus on PhpStorm, how to use Xdebug in PhpStorm so that you can work your way through the code. And also, I will show you just a few extra PhpStorm plugins you can use just to make your life easier when you're navigating Drupal's epic, massive code base. Okay, so let's start off with the first section. Stop the caches or stop the caches, whichever way you want to pronounce it. It still does the same thing. When you are debugging a Drupal site, you first of all want to stop it from caching things, okay? Because Drupal 8 caches a lot more stuff than Drupal 7. But first, I'll show you what you need to do. So if you open up your settings.php file, you'll see this bit of code. Let me just bring up the highlighter. You'll see this bit of code towards the bottom. Normally, it's commented out, but I've uncommented here. And essentially, it's just saying, okay, check and see if this file exists. If it does, include it. Now, you might be thinking, where do I get this settings.local? Well, if you go to your sites directory, you should see an example.settings.local.php. Simply copy that into default or your sites folder. And I don't mean sites. I mean, if you were to set up a multi-site setup, you can have different folders within sites, but usually you just use default. So simply copy that into default. Of course, remove example and dot so that it's just settings.local.php and you are good to go. And of course, make sure you comment this little bit out in your settings.php. And this local settings points to a different services.yaml. Now, the services.yaml, now this comes with Drupal 8 core. So if you have a copy of Drupal 8, you can go check it out now. And this services.yaml implements a few things. So it defines custom parameters. So this is debug cacheability headers and also custom services. This essentially means that the cache.backend.null service will point to a null backend factory. So nothing will be cached. But the extra part that's not part of the core version is this Twig. So this twig.config. And you can grab a copy of this just if you search for how to turn on debugging in Drupal 8. And essentially what this does is that it first of all turns on debugging for Twig. And I'll show you that in a second. It also turns off caching because if you were to open up a Twig template and modify it and refresh a Drupal site, nothing will change. And the reason for that is because the rendered Twig templates are cached. So you have to be aware of that. So this turns off caching, and also auto-loading just means, I assume it just auto-loads new templates. And then if you have a look in your settings.local, now this is just a tiny part, but the 2 most important things here is this settings for the renderer and the dynamic page cache. So by default, it is commented out, but you want to uncomment this because this will stop Drupal from caching things. And this is very important. And of course, you want to turn off the aggregation for CSS and JavaScript if you are doing front-end code. All right, demo time. Now, I like to keep my slides to a minimum. Trust me, there's only 20 odd slides. That's nothing. So let's go over and look at some actual code examples. And I'll show you what I mean. So here you can see the two settings.local and also the development.services.yaml. And then here I've already set it up. So if I go into my settings.local, it pulls in the development.services.yaml, which is great. You can even change the error level. So if it should be displayed to the front end or not. Of course, if you are running this if you are running a Drupal site in production, you don't want to show any errors. Locally, you perhaps want to show all the errors so you can fix them up straight away, even errors and warnings as well. And then you have this little section here that I've already talked about. We set the backend cache, and then we have a few extra options here. But the one that will probably throw a few people off is this extension discovery scan tests. What's that? Okay, so by default, in the local settings, it's set to true. And what this does is that it'll show all modules and themes which are used for tests to a site builder. Now, in Drupal 7 and in Drupal 8, Drupal 7 has a lot of test coverage, has thousands and thousands of tests. Drupal 8 as well has thousands and thousands of tests. Now, when you are writing tests, sometimes it could be a good idea to create a test module which gets programmatically installed when you run the test, just to kind of mock data or just prepare things. So if you are maintaining a module and you create some test suites, and you create a module or theme and classify it as a test, and you do that just by adding it to, I think, the test category, then by default, it'll be hidden. But if this is turned on, you will be able to see it. And I'll show you what I mean by that. If I go to, say, appearance, so this is my little development site. If I go to appearance, you will see that you can see all of these test themes. And this can be a bit annoying if you're clicking around and working on a Drupal site. So you may or may not want to turn it off. Well, let me just show you quickly the modules here. You can see all these test modules. Look at it. There's a ton of test modules. So unless you're utilizing these modules, just flick that to false. Okay, so that's pretty much, oh, well, let me just open up this section as well. So you have the services.yaml, and the first thing I'll show you is this this twig.config and this debug option. Now this helps you debug Twig templates, because I'm sure if you have worked on any Drupal site, you might look at this bit of code and say, or this bit of markup and say, how do I change that? In which template is that stored in? Well, if you turn on the Twig debug, what you get, if you view the source, is you will see this bit of comment. So this comment gets added at the beginning of each template, and then right at the end, so that it tells you when the template was started and when it ended. And then, of course, in between, you have all these other templates. So you can see here, this block template was loaded up and so on and so forth. But this makes it easy to figure out where this markup is stored, because essentially it tells you the theme function. So this one is, of course, HTML. This is the main one. Then it tells you where that Twig template is stored. And then it gives you file name suggestions. So if you want to override the HTML template just on this user page, you can simply copy the html.html.twig rename it to this, and then this will get picked up. And then I don't know if you can see, but there's also a little X here, which means this template was picked up. So it even tells you exactly which template was picked up. So this is pretty useful. The only time it can get a bit too much and a bit annoying is if you inspect and you have a lot of divs and you want to kind of get your head around to see how much markup is getting generated, especially if you are utilizing paragraphs and nested paragraphs and nested paragraphs. It can get a bit too much, especially seeing all the comments. But you can turn off, it is somewhere in here. I think you can turn off comments. I know you can do it in Chrome. No, it's here somewhere. I swear it's here. Disable. The thing is though, you can turn off comments somewhere here. Anyway, you can turn it off in the services.yaml or in Chrome and Firefox. Okay, so that is that. I'm just looking at my little list here so I don't forget anything. So the next thing I want to show you, and this is something new in Drupal 8. And I mentioned that Drupal likes to cache things. Okay. Now, some people say that Drupal 8 is much faster if it's hosted properly. So if you are using a reverse proxy like Varnish, or using like a rudimentary CDN, or no, like a pretty good CDN like CloudFront, it is much faster. But one thing that Drupal 8 does is that it caches individual elements. So this block is cached. The actual output of this block is cached. This rendered element here is cached. And even if you are logged in, you would still see a cached version. Now in Drupal 7, if you were logged in, you wouldn't see anything cached. But in Drupal 8, even if you are logged in, there are certain things which are cached. Now, I could do a whole webinar on this, okay? This is the whole caching system and the whole rendering system, and or maybe 2 webinars. But if somebody else would, wants to do a webinar about it, please let me know. Ivan@webwash.net. I'll be more than happy to set things up for you to do a presentation on that, because I know in my experience in the last 7 months that I've been fully focused on Drupal 8, the whole caching system has really thrown me off. Especially if you are using paragraphs and custom blocks, you may have issues where if you are loading up a custom block multiple times, the first version will get cached, and then you won't see the updated version because it's been loaded up multiple times, because Drupal has rendered the entity, cached it, and that's it. So the way Drupal invalidates a lot of this cache stuff is by using cache tags. And I hope you can see here. Let me just try and, no, it's not showing up. No, it's not loading up. But right here, you have this X Drupal cache tags. And by turning on this debug cacheability headers, it bubbles up all of the cache tags so that you can see all the tags which were set up. So if you're trying to debug caching issues, or something's just not working, or you push this stuff into UAT or your staging site where you have caching turned on, and then your testers say, oh, this is always caching, this hasn't updated, which has happened to me because locally I've got caching turned off. So everything works until I test it out, by having a different version of the site and things like that. So this cacheability headers just bubbles up these tags and also the cache context. So this can help you debug caching issues. Okay. And just finally, before we move on, when you turn off a lot of this caching capability, your site will run slow. I mean, it'll run twice as slow. So if you are planning to create a lot of views or do a lot of back-end work and not much development, I would highly recommend that you comment these out, because your site will run twice as fast if you are creating content types, creating fields, spending half a day in Drupal's backend as I like to call it, click-based development, where everything's just click, click, click. And especially if you are creating custom views, a lot of that's in the back end. So turn this stuff off, because you'll save yourself hours and hours of time. I would actually love for somebody to do a study to see how many times a Drupal site is loaded up, especially a local version. And just another thing, just before we move on, make sure you are running Drupal 8 on PHP 7. There's no excuses now to run anything below PHP 7. Every Drupal 8 site I've used has always used PHP 7, and I haven't had any compatibility issues. You will get 30 to 40% performance increase. Of course, mileage may vary, but in my experience, your site runs so much faster in PHP 7. So that's just another thing. So contact your sysadmins or your DevOps team, and if you're not running Drupal 8 on PHP 7, then you should be. I'm not sure about Drupal 7, but run Drupal 8 on PHP 7. All right, so let's move on. Let's go back into our slides just for a few quick slides. And the next thing I want to talk about is Devel. Now, Devel has been around for years, and when I actually took a screenshot of this, I'm not sure if you can see, but here you can see a date of the 29th of September 2003. So that's when this project node was created. So Devel has been around for years. And if you have used Drupal 7, then you're fully aware of it. But in Drupal 8, the module comes with a few extra things. So the first thing is having the ability to print variables to the screen. So in Drupal 7 and below, you had, I think, what is it, DPM, DSM, and those functions would use a PHP library called Chromo, I've probably pronounced it wrong, but that PHP library for printing variables is unmaintained. So Devel has moved over to Kint, which is a newer, more modern PHP library for printing out variables and arrays and objects. And you can print things by using the Kint function or KSM. Now, the difference between Kint is that Kint will place it at the top of your page, but KSM will output anything to the message area. So essentially, it will store it in the session and then show it to you in the message area. So I often use KSM. And if you want to print anything out in Twig, just use the Kint function as well. And then the next thing is WebProfiler. Now, WebProfiler is a little toolbar at the bottom of your Drupal site, and it gives you all this amazing information and great insights into what's happening on your Drupal site. You can see the time it took to download the page, the query count, the memory usage. You can even see any type of forms, what type of forms were loaded up. You can also see what events were loaded up. So that's new in Drupal 8. And all of this comes to us thanks to Symfony, because if you have used the Symfony framework, then you should be familiar with this toolbar, because Drupal 8 uses a lot of Symfony components. All right, demo time now. Let's get back in. So let's go to our Drupal site. And what I'll do is I'll first install Kint and show you Kint. So just search for Kint and I'll install it. So I really need some hold music while the site installs. Sorry, the module installs. Okay, so if we go to PhpStorm, and what I'll do is I'll close this, and I will print out some variables in the Bartek theme. So of course, don't do this on a proper Drupal site. You don't want to modify anything within the core directory. I'm just doing that because, you know, I don't want this webinar to go for too long. And if I type in KSM, and then let's just print out the variables, make sure that's all closed up. And then let's go back to the site. You'll see this nice little bar which has been added to the messages area. And you can easily navigate what's been printed by clicking on the row. But if you want to expand everything, just click on the plus, and that'll expand absolutely everything. So you can see there's a lot here. So again, if you want to just display the next level, well, let me close that again. If you want to display just the next level, click on the row. If you want to display everything, click on the plus. Okay. Another thing you can do is have a look at the stack trace. You probably can't see this, but trust me, there is a stack trace there. It's just terribly colored. It's a terrible contrast. And another thing that Kint does is that you can see which class this object is part of. And then if you drill down, so let's have a look at this account proxy class. You can see then the available methods on that class. So this is good, especially if you're getting used to the way Drupal 8 is, and you don't have that much experience with objects and classes and all that type of stuff. So yeah, I would highly recommend that you install Kint, have a play around, drop KSM somewhere, drop this function in, and then just have a look and see what's actually outputted, which is a good way to learn things. Okay, so let's just close that off, and I'll quickly show you what it looks like in Twig. So if I go Kint, and then let's just pass in this page variable, and if I hit refresh, it'll appear up the top because remember, KSM outputs everything into the messages area. That's why we saw it here. But Kint pops everything up here. And then you can easily work your way through. Okay, so that is Kint. Pretty simple. But make sure you've turned off all the caching, or you would have to rebuild the site cache every single time you add Kint in, and it can be a bit of a pain. So that's why it's important to turn off the caching. All right, let's now jump over and install WebProfiler. That's my favorite tool of choice. I really enjoy using it. So I think is it one space? Yeah, see, sometimes it's WebProfiler with a space, sometimes it isn't. Anyway. Okay, let's just give that a second. Oh. I really need some background music for this. I think because I'm also streaming this out to you guys, it's extra slow. My computer. All right. Now we can see this little bar down at the bottom here. So what I'll do, let me just fix this up so you all can see it. Let me bring this up. Oh, there we go. Okay. All right. So you get this nice bar down at the bottom here. And you can see things such as the request, the memory usage, the time it took to download, the amount of queries, the logged in users, any views that were loaded up, any forms that were loaded up. This is actually pretty useful just to see the forms. What else? Config. I think this is all the assets loading up. So you can configure a few things. What was that? Oh, okay. So they link over to Drupal. Okay. So if you go to configure WebProfiler, you can configure a few things. All right. So the first thing you want to do is say turn on, I like events, and let's just turn on events. And then if we click on save configuration, and then go back to the home page, we should see events. Now, the event system is new in Drupal 8. It comes to us thanks to Symfony, and eventually it's going to replace the whole hook system. But of course now we still have hooks. But often when you are developing custom functionality, it's important to know when a particular event was triggered or if it wasn't triggered. So that's why I often turn on this event stuff here, because it can give you a nice list of all the events that were fired off, and more importantly, the priority in which they were fired off. Because you may have an issue where an event which is implemented by another module overrides your bit of code. So this is why it's important to have a look at all this stuff, okay? And another thing to be aware of is that WebProfiler actually, hence the name Profiler, it profiles every single page. and stores a copy of it so that you can review it. So you can see all of the queries for that page, any events, and so on and so forth. So over time, you will get a lot of profiles here. So you can access all of this just by going to Reports, WebProfiler, and then you can see all the list here. And then you can just go back here and have a look and see how many queries were running for that particular page, and so on and so forth. Okay, so if we were to go to database query, 157 queries. That's not that bad, actually. That's how many queries were implemented, which is pretty good. And then you can see all the queries here. Now, another thing you may notice, let me just zoom in a bit, is that it tells you the class and also the method that was used for this query. And if we click on it, we get a page not found because it tries to open up this file using this protocol. But what we can do is we can configure PhpStorm. No, we can configure WebProfiler to open up that file in PhpStorm. And I'll show you how to do that. Let's just go back. I think we need to go back to configure. And I've got, where's Atom? And I've got this little example here. And I got this, I got this example bit of code from the README, and also I've written about this on WebWash. So if you search for WebWash WebProfiler, I think I wrote about it a year ago, you can get this example. And then just click on Save. And then if we just have a look here, you can see anything that points to a particular control, like a class or a method, will now open up in PhpStorm. Now that is awesome. That is absolutely awesome. This just, this bit of functionality has saved me so many times, has just saved me a ton of time having to search for things. It's like, okay, so where is this particular page? Is it a controller? Is it a this? Is it a that? Is it a form? It just saves me so much. And then if we have a look at, say, the triggered events, and say you click on that, you can easily just look at this, request data collector. What's this? Click on it and you go directly to it. Now, this is pretty cool. This is pretty cool. Okay, so I'm just looking at my notes here. Okay, well, that's it for this section. Let's just open this up. The next thing I want to talk about, so let's just go back to the home page. Let's go back to our slides. So that's it with Devel. So trust me, download it, have a play with it if you've never played around with it, and also check out the other sub-modules. If we have a look at it, you will see. All right, well, there's no folder called sub modules, but the Devel generate is another sub module, which is used to generate dummy content. So that's another reason to use Devel. Okay, so let's now move on to part 3, which is Drupal console. Okay, so Drupal console is a CLI tool or command line interface tool. And I'm just reading this little bit of this sentence here. A tool to generate boilerplate code and interact with and debug Drupal. Now, the part that we are most interested in today is debug Drupal, but Drupal console is mostly used to generate code. And if you are writing Drupal 8 code, make sure you play around with Drupal console because it'll save you a ton of time. Now, if you want to learn how to create a module in Drupal 8, how to create a custom block, then it's important to understand the code. So that's when boilerplate code or code generators can be a bit of an issue, because if you use them a lot, you don't really understand what's happening, and then when something breaks, you're kind of lost. So if you are learning Drupal 8, by all means, write it by hand. But once you understand the basics of the code, use Drupal console to generate your code. It'll save you a ton of time. But the part that we are interested in is the commands to debug things in Drupal 8. So if you were to run the command Drupal list and then grep and search for debug, you'll see a list of all of these debug commands. And the three that I use the most is the container debug, which has an alias of cod, then the module debug, which returns a list of all installed modules, or it has an alias of mod. And then you have router debug or router debug, whichever way you want to pronounce it. And this lists out all routes with the route name and the path. Because in Drupal 8, if you want to link to a page, you need to know the route name. You can't link to the path. Whereas in Drupal 7, you could just link to the path. And I do remember the first time I tried to create just a basic URL in Drupal 8 programmatically in code, and I spent like 2 hours trying to figure out how to do that. Because you have to create a URL object, a link object, it just gets too much. So yeah, just remember these three aliases, cod, mod, and rod. It's honestly, it is the beginning of a joke, but they are pretty cool aliases. All right, so let's just have a look at that. Now let me bring up my terminal. I'm zoomed in. Let me just clear that. So if I was to run Drupal list, I'll see all, let's just load this up. I'll see all available commands. And let me just bring this up a bit more. So then if I see Drupal list, grep, then debug, you should see a list of all commands with the term debug in it. And as I mentioned, the one that I use the most is the router. So if I type in Drupal router debug and then run that, it'll give me a list of all the routes, the name, the route name, which is the most important, and also the path. And so if I was to then want to search for things, I could go grep, user, like that. So this will return anything that has the path of user in it. And then if I want to link off to the login page, I will just create a route using user.login. And another one is Drupal, module debug. This will return a list of all modules. But this returns everything. So unless there's a argument, but I just go installed. I think you need to put an uppercase I, and this will return all installed modules. And another thing is that you can also see which update hook was run. And this is only important if you have broken a site and you need to know exactly which update hook was run, or you're working on a big site where you have multiple developers and everyone's writing update hooks, and that's a very low level thing. But as you can see, Drupal console has a lot of useful commands. And honestly, if you haven't played around with Drupal console, please install it, have a play with it. Use it. It's important. It's a huge thing in Drupal 8. I still use Drupal console as well as Drush. A lot of people say, Drupal console is going to deprecate Drush. I still use Drush. So I use both. Okay? So I highly recommend you use it. Check it out. Have a play with it. Okay, so how are we going with time? 35 minutes. Okay. Let's now look at part 4 and our final part, and that is around PhpStorm. So let me just open up this and the last set of slides, PhpStorm and Xdebug. Now, PhpStorm has pretty good integration with Xdebug. And when you set a breakpoint and run do a request, PhpStorm then brings up this debug interface where on the left, let me bring this up, on the left you can see a stack trace, and you can see everywhere where your request has gone through. And then on the right here, you can see all available variables and also classes and objects and arrays. Now, in Drupal 7, I very rarely used a debugger. But in Drupal 8, I use it a lot more. And I don't think it's because of Drupal 8. I think it's because PhpStorm just makes it easy to use. And locally, for my development server, so locally I run a copy of Drupal, of course, and I use MAMP Pro because I'm on a Mac. Now, of course, I'm not as elite as other people. I don't use Homebrew and set up my own concoction and Vagrant and Docker and stuff like that because Vagrant's too slow for me. But MAMP just works, okay? And MAMP has Xdebug out of the box. PhpStorm has support for Xdebug, and there's very little to set up, and it just works. And another thing that PhpStorm has is that it has integration with Drupal, and I'll show you a bit about that. But when you create a new project in PhpStorm will detect that you are using Drupal, and you will see a little pop-up saying, "Oh, do you want to turn on Drupal integration?" I would highly recommend you do that, and I'll show you why in a second. But there are a few extra plugins that you should also install. Now, PhpStorm the company behind PhpStorm is JetBrains, and JetBrains has their main flagship product, which is IntelliJ, which is a massive IDE for Java. And then you have different distributions of IntelliJ for PHP, for like PhpStorm. I think WebStorm also just for Node and JavaScript and front-end stuff. But this means that there's a huge ecosystem of plugins for it, which are maintained by other people. And the three that I download is Drupal Symfony Bridge. You can kind of guess from the name what it does. It bridges Drupal and Symfony. PHP annotations, and also Symfony plugin. Now, I don't know which one does what, but I think Drupal Symfony Bridge optionally recommends you install PHP annotations. Anyway, just download these three plugins, okay? Just download them and install them. And I'll show you how to use them. What's next? No, okay, we're not going to there. Okay, let's now jump into PhpStorm. Now, before I talk about PhpStorm, so first of all, I don't work for JetBrains. I just like their product. It's a good product. It's not the most perfect product. And I would like to also reiterate that if you prefer something else, then by all means use it. If you prefer Sublime Text, Atom, Visual Code, which is Visual Studio Code, Emacs, Vim, Eclipse, I don't care. Just use whatever you are comfortable with. Developers are often dogmatic about their tools of choice, be it Drupal versus WordPress, PhpStorm versus Sublime. I just recently had a chat with a friend where he was saying, "Oh, PhpStorm is slow." And I'm like, well, yeah, of course, Sublime Text is much faster. Well, it's not that much faster, but if you have an SSD and you have enough RAM, PhpStorm gives you a lot out of the box where the performance for me isn't everything, but for some people it is. And if you prefer to use Sublime Text, use it. What I'm trying to say is that use whichever tool you are most productive in, because at the end of the day, if you can write code faster in Vim or Emacs or Sublime Text, then use it, okay? Just use it. But my tool of choice is PhpStorm. Now, I'm also not paid by JetBrains to promote their product. I just like to use it, okay? So the first thing I'll show you is how to turn on debugging, okay? So let's go back to our bartech.theme, and I'll pop a little breakpoint here. So this little red thing, okay, these are breakpoints. So if I pop it here and then turn on up the top here, let me just move this. Up the top here, this turns on the listener so that when we refresh the page, it will, just give it a second. It will redirect us back to PhpStorm, and we get this nice little stack trace on the left, and we get these variables on the right. And then by clicking on these options, you can step over and make your way through the code. And another thing you can do, let me just bring this down and also pop this down. you can see that it actually outputs what's in the variables. Okay, and then if you go back in time, so you can go back in time, and then it will tell you where it actually went into, so which function it stepped into. Okay, so I would highly recommend that you play around with Xdebug. It takes a bit of getting used to, but it's well worth it. Now, another thing you can do, so let me just cancel this. What you can also do is add in multiple breakpoints. And Drupal will break at the first breakpoint, and then if you resume the program, it will then jump to the next breakpoint. And I'll show you how to do that. So here, here I've added in a breakpoint on this pre-process HTML, and then this page title. So if I refresh, don't worry about this being white. It's all right. Oh, sorry. Make sure you turn on the event listener. All right, let me just hit refresh. You'll see that it first jumps at this breakpoint. And then if you click on this resume, give it a second, it will jump to the next one. So this really helps with jumping between certain breakpoints, okay? Trust me, have a play with it. It takes a bit of getting used to, but as I said, I used it in Drupal. I've been using it in Drupal 8 a lot. Okay, so we have one question. Okay, just quickly one question. Do you need to do something on the server or in PHP to run Xdebug? So yeah, you need to set up Xdebug. Now, I'm not going to go through the process of setting it up because it requires a fair bit of configuring, but MAMP supports Xdebug out of the box. And if I go into MAMP, and then I think you go, then in PhpStorm, let me just close this. Then right down the bottom, you have to set up a few things down here as well. But MAMP gives you this out of the box. So yes, you first need to set up Xdebug, which is a PHP extension, and then you need to set up Xdebug in PhpStorm as well. But PhpStorm has, I think they call it zero-touch configuration, that it works if it's set up properly. Okay, if it's set up properly. And the best experience I've had is with MAMP and also PhpStorm. All right. So that is debugging in PHP. Let me show you debugging in Twig templates. Now, of course, it's not going to work exactly the way that you saw it. You can't step through Twig code, but you can set a breakpoint in your code and then in your Twig templates, and then see all of the available variables. So let me open up templates, page, and what I'll do is I've got this example here. Here we go. You need to install Devel for this, and this comes with Devel. Just pop in this. Turn on the event listener. And then if you load up, now don't worry about this looking broken, that's because it was terminated. If we load it up, you'll see that it goes directly to this function, this Twig extension. But the thing that we really want is context. So this is all of the variables that are available in that Twig template. Now, as I mentioned, you can't step through Twig templates like you can with PHP because it's Twig, it's not PHP. But you can have a look and see all the available variables just by popping in that Devel breakpoint. There is another module called, I think, Twig breakpoint for Drupal 8. You can use that, but the Devel one does pretty much the same thing. Okay. All right. So that is Xdebug. Now, I know I haven't covered that much with Xdebug. I could, again, do another whole webinar on it. And maybe in the future I will, but I've just started using it in the last 6 months, like using it properly. Whereas before, I only ever used it to really get my head around things. But in Drupal 8, I've really started to use it a lot because everything's an object now. Okay, so let's just close that and also close this. And what I'll talk about now is just the Drupal integration you get with PhpStorm. So let me go into a module. Let me just go into Devel. And one thing that PhpStorm gives you, so if you want to turn on Drupal integration, you just go into Preference and search for Drupal, and you should see Enable Drupal integration, and then you just go, point it to your Drupal installation. And one of the things that it does is that it gives you a list of all available hooks. So if I start typing in a name, the module name, you can see it gives me a list of every available hook, which is pretty cool. So if I want to search for entity, view, say view alter, it'll create the proper comments and also put in the proper arguments. Okay? Now the next thing, I don't know if you can see this, but you can also then go, if you click on this little up arrow here, it'll take you to the documentation for this hook. And then when you are in this documentation for the hook, you can even click on this down arrow and see other implementations of the hook. And then you can drill down, which is actually pretty good because sometimes this code example is broken and doesn't work. And it's good to see a copy of the hook and how it's actually implemented. And another thing you can do, you can see where this hook is invoked, because sometimes you want to know exactly where the hook is invoked. Is it before something gets saved or after something gets saved? And this can actually help you in figuring out where it gets invoked. So again, highly recommend you turn on Drupal 8, Drupal integration with PhpStorm. All right, so let's go back and remove this bit of code. So the next thing I want to show you is these 3 modules, okay? These 3 plugins that I talked about earlier. And I'll start off by talking about the problem. So if you click on services.yaml, routing.yaml, everything's a YAML in Drupal 8. And with the routing system, you can see, okay, this path, admin/config development/devel points to this class. But how do you get to this class? What is the easiest way of navigating to this class? Yes, you could select this and then search for this particular method, but then you can see that there's a lot of methods with, a lot of classes with the name settings form. Okay, and sometimes it can be tedious just jumping around trying to figure out, okay, I just want to get to this router rebuild confirmation form. How do I get to it? Well, if you download those 3 plugins, which I mentioned, and then turn on enable plugin for this project. Normally you have to restart PhpStorm, but I don't have to because I just disabled it. If you click on your command or your go-to button, you can then straight away navigate to the class just by clicking on the class name. You can even navigate to where this permission was defined as well. Okay, so this makes it very easy just to work your way around the YAML files. And again, with the services, if you want to define custom services, you can go directly to the service. You can even go to the service that's added as an argument as well. And then here you get this little icon which goes back to where it was implemented. So if you're using PhpStorm, please you download these 3 plugins. I will add these 3 plugins to the email once I get this video out, so you don't worry about it if you missed it. I will list out those plugins in the email that gets sent out. I'm just looking at my list. No, I think that's it for today. Okay.